Start in about a minute. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our January lecture in our Understanding ADHD lecture series from Chad of Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C. I'm Cheryl Gedzelman, treasurer of our chapter, and tonight we are pleased to have Kathy Kuhl, homeschooling expert, present the lecture, Homeschooling, Not What You May Think. And we hope you will plan to join us for future lectures. Our chapter, Chad of Northern Virginia and DC, is one of the many chapters in the Chad National Organization, and such aligns with the mission of improving the lives of those affected with ADHD. We are a volunteer organization of trained professionals who offer support in a number of ways. In addition to offering this free monthly lecture series on the second Tuesday evening of most months, we also have support groups for parents, students, and adults. And these support groups are all online now. And we have an annual resource fair to highlight ADHD Awareness Month, which has been online the past couple of years, but we'll be back in person as soon as we can do it. While we're all volunteers, we cover expenses through membership dues, donations, and sponsorships. And if you're not already a member, we encourage you to be one. Now I'd like to introduce Kathy Kuhl. Kathy speaks internationally. She writes and coaches parents teaching children with learning challenges. She has written 3 books on homeschooling, which you can see on her website, learndifferently.com. That's learndifferently.com. A graduate of William and Mary University, Ms. Kuhl has taught math and English in public and private homeschool classes. We are going to start the lecture now, and if you have questions, please write them in the chat box, and we will be monitoring the questions, and the monitor, Kathy Essig, will be bringing up the questions as they fit in. Thank you. It's your turn, Kathy.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I see some familiar names, and that's fun. I want to thank Chad of Northern Virginia, DC, for having me this evening. I've been a member of this chapter for many years, and it helped our family, and it's a privilege to be with you all. Let me show you a picture or two here. I'll start some slides. And how are we looking? Cheryl, can you see that? Can someone unmute and tell me if we're good?
To be in the slide.
Right.
There you go.
Just want to ask you that before I start. There we go. Okay. The other day, my neighbor told me she is really glad her 4 daughters are back in school. She said, I could never homeschool. It was so hard keeping them on track. But I answered, homeschooling would be completely different. You would get to choose the materials and the activities and the schedule. And she looked at me for a minute in surprise and said, oh, yes, it would. In fact, I'd say that as hard as my neighbor worked, she hasn't homeschooled yet. What she did in some ways was harder than homeschooling. It was certainly less interesting for her and probably less engaging for her kids. Because of the pandemic, millions of parents may think that they have tried homeschooling, but real homeschooling is different from virtual schooling. In this talk, I will describe what homeschooling is and how it's grown. I will explain some misconceptions about homeschooling, and I'll tell why parents chose to homeschool kids with ADHD and other learning challenges, what struggles those families face, and what advantages they enjoy. You'll also learn about a few of the many resources and supports that are available, including resources that can help you even if you have no intention of ever homeschooling, which was originally my plan. My goal is to show you that homeschooling can be a good way for students with ADHD to learn. Let's begin by defining homeschooling. Homeschooling is parent-directed education. The American Heritage Dictionary defines to homeschool as to instruct in an educational program outside of established schools. The DC State Superintendent of Education defines homeschooling as a, quote, private parent or legal guardian directed education program. The next thing to know about homeschooling is that it's back. Homeschoolers like to tell you how many famous Americans were homeschooled. Many presidents and inventors, including Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Graham Bell, Thomas Edison, the Wright brothers, George Washington Carver were all homeschooled, along with many writers, musicians, and leaders, including many today. And homeschooling was pretty popular until compulsory education began to spread, beginning in Massachusetts in 1885. As compulsory education spread, private schools and homeschooling became illegal, so homeschooling went underground, and therefore we don't have data for that period. But dissatisfaction among some families with public school fueled the growth of private schools and homeschools. And I should point out at this point, I am not anti-public school. I'm just giving you the history. I have been a public school teacher, as Cheryl mentioned, and one of my kids stayed in public school while we homeschooled the other child. As dissatisfaction spread, homeschooling grew. Private schools also grew. Homeschool was legalized again in Virginia in 1984. And by 1999, there were over 750,000 kids in the US being homeschooled. And by 2016, it was 1.6 million. This according to the National Center for Educational Statistics of the Department of Energy, the Household Survey of Education. Then something really strange happened. During the pandemic, homeschooling doubled in a 6-month period. In April of 2020, just 1 month into the pandemic, the Department of Education's Household Pulse Survey recorded that 5.4% of US households with children said they were homeschooling. 6 months later, in October, that number had more than doubled to 11%. And actually, the real number of families was probably higher, because for the October survey, the Census Bureau narrowed that definition of homeschooling to make sure that they only counted what they called, quote, true homeschooling rather than virtual learning through a private or public or private school, close quote. So the April number of 5.4 probably included some virtual education, but in October, 6 months later, it did not. So that's a significant increase. The increase was across all ethnicities and races, but among Black households with school-age children, homeschooling increased 5 times, from 3.3% to 16.1%, which is quite striking. And later we can talk about possible reasons for that, although of course the survey didn't address them. Next, I want to look at a few misconceptions about homeschooling. Homeschooling's growing. What do those families know that you may not? Why are people jumping into this? Let's look at some common misconceptions about homeschooling. The first is we should understand that homeschool doesn't mean you have to stay home. More than one homeschooling mom I know has joked around that they aren't homeschooling, they're car schooling, because they're so busy going from one activity to another, group classes and activities. While I don't recommend keeping your child with ADHD in the car for very long, would have driven my son crazy, it is important to realize that homeschoolers do get out and about, and they use their car time very effectively, listening to recorded books, playing educational games, practicing their foreign language, their Latin declensions, their math facts. That was one thing we did. So homeschoolers don't stay home. In fact, I know families who homeschooled while taking long sailing voyages or even traveling around the world. 2 homeschooled teens I know got their pilot's licenses at 16 while they were being homeschooled. For one of them, it was being able to get flying lessons was a reward for getting through some work that he was not particularly interested in over a long period. Hands-on learning is great for distractible students, and getting out and doing things brings lessons to life. As a former public school teacher, I know that field trips are a lot easier when you don't have to supervise 100 kids and book school buses. So as a homeschooling family ourselves, our family averaged 1 field trip a month compared to 1 a year when I taught junior high. That was during our elementary school years. And we went out other days for Spanish club, for karate lessons, for swimming, for soccer, and for homeschool group classes occasionally. I'll wait. Okay. Every family has to find their own pace about going out, though. Even extroverts and kids with ADHD, like my son, need time at home and a regular schedule to make progress. So understand homeschooling doesn't mean you have to stay home. Second misconception is that, let's see, there. Homeschooling doesn't mean that you parents personally have to teach every subject yourselves. Homeschooling parents, especially of older children, tend to see themselves more as facilitators. We can outsource some of our children's instruction, especially subjects we don't want to teach. There are many co-ops, homeschool group classes in person and online. There are video lessons. There are tutors that can help with subjects that parents don't want to teach. Homeschoolers also pool their resources. For instance, when my son was finishing 8th grade, I was looking around trying to decide what I was going to do for biology for his 9th grade science credit. I wanted him to take biology. I could have taught it. I was a biology major briefly. I asked my friend Cindy what she was doing. She had a son going into 9th grade as well. She was a registered nurse. She said she was teaching her son herself. She told me what curriculum she was using, and she offered to teach my son along with hers if I would teach them both English. I said, it's a deal. So we began a tiny little co-op. Two other boys from 2 other families joined us, and this foursome learned a lot. They worked hard and they had fun together. My friend, to answer a question someone asked me this afternoon, my friend, the nurse, like many other homeschoolers, knew that there are companies online that will let you order educational supplies, including lab equipment and, yes, frogs in the formaldehyde and whatever they're using now for that. So they were able to do their dissections and a very complete, thorough science course in my friend's home while I taught English in her living room. That 4-to-1 student-teacher ratio we had in that co-op really helped my son focus. You may know that researchers in education generally measure academic engaged time. That's how much time a student is engaged, not just sitting there listening, but doing something, writing, responding somehow or other. That academic engaged time is a great way to measure effectiveness of education. And it's a lot harder to have unengaged kids in the small classes that homeschool groups usually have. So that's great for our kids with ADHD. So rest assured, homeschoolers aren't teaching everything themselves. The third misconception about homeschooling is that homeschool has to look like a school. And it really doesn't. Homeschoolers have many ways to handle this. I interviewed 64 homeschooling families. 26 of them had kids with ADHD. The rest had learning disabilities and or autism or some combination. I did all those interviews before I wrote my first book, Homeschooling Your Struggling Learner, which I wrote to be a handbook for families launching on this process. The thing I wish I'd had when I'd started. One of the moms said something useful to me in the interviews. She said, quote, when you're trying to duplicate the school environment at home, keep in mind that it didn't work at school. That's why he's at home. And she added, duplicating that environment may bring negative emotions. As parents, we want to make sure our kids go to get a good education. And sometimes without thinking about it, we just assume that we need to replicate our own school experience. Instead, it's better to just do what works. Another misconception about homeschoolers is that we're weird. Well, most of us aren't. Admit it, you probably have met some unusual folks at your PTA meetings, right? I did when I was a PTA leader before we homeschooled. Now, some people imagine that homeschoolers all dress like Amish, we all wear denim jumpers, or that homeschoolers are all evangelical Protestants who quote the Bible all the time, or that they're all Republican or all conservative. But actually, that's not the case. Homeschoolers come from all backgrounds and ethnicities, all religions and philosophies, anywhere you can imagine. There are Muslim homeschool groups, Jewish homeschool curriculum, Catholic homeschool conferences, homeschool pages for Hindu homeschoolers, pagan homeschool groups, and many, many groups that are open to everyone. Homeschoolers do have a few things in common. Despite all their diversity, one thing they have in common is they all care deeply about education, just like my friends that were leading the PTA I was active in. And another thing is homeschoolers don't mind being a little bit different. So maybe that's where that weird idea come from. On this slide, I couldn't resist adding a famous homeschooler, you know, Simone Biles, the Olympic champion. And our family is at the lower right. You'll see the four of us at my son's graduation. Not everyone has their high school graduation on top of a mountain in Scotland. So I guess we're a little weird too. A fifth misconception about homeschooling is that homeschoolers are unsocialized, that they don't know how to get along with people. Many homeschool groups in the Washington, D.C. area are providing lots of opportunities for kids to get out and about. I found that I could coach my child in social skills better because I saw a little more of his interactions. I wasn't with him 24/7, but I could see some more of the social cues my son was missing. Some parents who homeschool or public school as well, will role play with their kids to help them practice the social skills they need to develop. If you have a child with social skills deficits, you can join groups and make social skills training a part of your homeschool. You can add that into your curriculum and devote time to it. I enjoyed this slide from the Georgia Home Education Association. A picture on this slide for those who can't see or are listening to a recording, shows someone saying, "I wish my fourth grade teacher who always says we're not here to socialize would please tell that to everyone who asks me about homeschool socialization," close quote. I bring that one up because it's a running joke among homeschoolers that I've seen bumper stickers that say, "Caution, wild unsocialized homeschoolers on board." The reality is that homeschool kids vary just like public school kids in terms of their social skills and abilities, but homeschoolers get more time with a diverse population. And as someone who had one child in public school and one child in homeschool, something else I noticed was that consistently, as I carpooled both kinds of groups, I noticed that the homeschool kids were much more comfortable talking with the adults and would do so at greater length. The public school kids were equally polite, but they'd basically say, "Hi, Mrs. Kuhl, how are you?" And then for most of the rest of the 40-minute drive, I might as well have been invisible, which has its advantages as a parent, as you parents of teens may know. I think the main problem that many of these misconceptions have in common is that homeschooling seems really weird because it's unfamiliar. And I've thought of a way to help you think about that unfamiliarity. Suppose you'd only ever eaten carryout or eaten in restaurants all your life. If someone talked to you then about cooking at home cooking might sound just crazy. You say to yourself, wait, I have to plan a menu, write a shopping list, go get the groceries, and then I'd have to figure out how to cook them. And then I'd have to wash all the dishes and the pots and pans. This sounds like a lot of work. Let's stick with carryout. Well, homeschooling is a bit like home cooking. Yeah, it's more work, but sometimes you get better quality. It enables you to pay more attention to your child's particular needs and to your preferences and your child's preferences. This works out in many ways in homeschooling. If you want to take a field day to go rock climbing or help in a political campaign, you can do it. If you want to go hiking or attend a rally or hear a symphony, if your child wants to compete in the Junior Olympics, you can do it. And I know homeschoolers who've done all those things. Like home cooking, homeschooling can be more satisfying for the cook and for those who eat it, or in this case, for the parents and the kids. There's a satisfaction in crafting a good supper for your family, and homeschoolers feel a similar satisfaction getting through a good day of homeschool. And just like with home cooking, in homeschooling, you don't always have to do everything from scratch. But I promised to address weaknesses and strengths, pros and cons. So I will admit, I want to definitely affirm that homeschoolers don't always find it easy. I interviewed 26 families with kids with ADHD, along with those other 40-some families, 38 families before writing my book. And I asked them all what disadvantages they found to homeschooling. I did this as an open-ended question and categorized their answers later. Interestingly, 15% of those families said there were no disadvantages at all to homeschooling. I found a few when I homeschooled, still glad I did it. Now, more than half said that one problem was stress on the parents. I should point out, though, that some parents said that it reduced their stress to homeschool because they no longer had to negotiate with the schools to get services and accommodations. Almost a third of the families said there were problems related to attention. That was a disadvantage to their homeschooling. So I want to be clear, homeschooling lets you eliminate lots of distractions and problems, but it's no cure for ADHD. 30% of the parents also reported that social problems were another disadvantage of homeschooling. You notice my numbers don't add up to 100% because I allowed more than one possible answer here. Some of these parents reported difficulty in working with homeschool parents who didn't understand their child's ADHD or autism or other learning challenges. Another portion of the parents, about a quarter of them, said that figuring out the right approach to homeschooling was a struggle for them. Cost was a problem for almost a fourth of them. Now, in some of these families, one parent stayed home to homeschool a forfeited income. I do know and can talk about in the question time creative solutions other families found to manage work and homeschool. And 15% of the families said that it had an effect on their family that was difficult. And a recurring thing I hear from parents occasionally is that grandparents or other relatives are concerned or object to homeschool. Sometimes those families do come around when they see the results. My parents did. My parents went from being very concerned about my homeschooling and expressing that repeatedly to volunteering to come in and help out a little bit. And eventually, for the last 7 years we homeschooled, my dear father came over once a week and taught history and government. Started out with me providing the materials, and by the end, he was writing lectures and planning field trips. He was a former government professor or public administration professor at George Mason University. And after he did that with my son for all those years, he said he only wished he'd done it with all the grandchildren. It was a wonderful opportunity we had. So effect on family can be an issue for some families. These families also reported many advantages to homeschooling. And I want to explain again that this is just the families I interviewed. This is not a comprehensive survey across the country, just this from the families I interviewed. The vast majority of them, almost a third, 2/3, said that the biggest advantage was being able to, or one advantage was being able to customize curriculum. You may not know that homeschoolers don't have to use the state curriculum. Now, different states have different requirements for what you do have to teach, and many require specific subjects be taught. They also have requirements that you let them know what you're teaching. But there are hundreds of different publishers you can use, and so you can dig through and pick out something that's pitched at the right level with the right angle that appeals to you and your child. I'm going to unpack a few of these specific advantages in a little more detail. Let's talk about advantages of being able to customize curriculum, since that was the most popular answer. When your child is in school, they learn what your school, the public school or the private school or the district or the county chooses. With homeschool, parents set their own goals. So perhaps learning more about your ethnic heritage is important to you. Some homeschool families have chosen to teach more about Black history or their Jewish heritage or other religious beliefs and backgrounds. Many families will include language instruction more heavily and sooner than public schools generally do. There are families that may look at their child's abilities and decide to spend time to emphasize entrepreneurship and help their children launch small businesses. A friend of mine has published a curriculum called Micro Business for Teens about helping kids to do that. My son loved history. He's the boy in the red shirt in this photo. He's helping raise the rigging at the Susan B. Constant down in Jamestown. So because of my son's love for history, we built a lot of our homeschool around history. Now, we did cover math and reading and science and other aspects of social studies and PE, but history ran through a lot of it. We read a lot of historical fiction. We went on field trips. We read biographies together. Your child's interests can shape your curriculum choices if you homeschool, whether it's writing a novel like the author of the Aragon series did. He was homeschooled when he wrote the first book of the Aragon series. Or it's perhaps your son or daughter's into woodworking, art, engineering. The possibilities are endless, and that can shape your homeschool choices and part of your day. You can also customize curriculum by changing it or adapting it for your child's specific needs. You can go faster or slower than needed. And this reminds me of a problem a lot of homeschool kids have. It's when adults ask them what grade they're in. If your child is 2 years above grade level in reading and a year behind in math and doing science with their 12-year-old sister, they may not know how to answer your question when you ask what grade it's in. I saw one cartoon where a little girl just said, "It's complicated." We're able to, as homeschooling parents, are able to flex and teach their child different subjects on different grade levels. Homeschoolers can also remediate areas of weakness and provide accommodations. Sometimes it's easier for the parents to provide accommodations than the school. Schools may be limited by budget or by policies that require them to spend quite a long time choosing what new assistive technology to adapt. As individual families, we can change things a lot faster. We can also change curriculum if something isn't working. I'll give you an example of one way homeschoolers can adapt curriculum. We took time in our homeschool day in junior high and high school to spend a lot of time working on study skills and executive functioning. And at one point, I think one of the years in high school, I may have given my son half a credit on his transcript for a study skills course. It would be quite easy to construct a study skills course for your child. I've shown here a few books I found helpful. Mary D. Sklar's book, 50 Tips to Help Students Succeed. Many of you probably know the two books by Dawson and Gorey, the Smart But Scattered and Smart But Scattered for Teens. You might not have seen the book at the top, Why Freshmen Fail and How to Avoid It, which is not all on executive functioning, but it's a terrific book that Professor Carol Reynolds wrote. She is a retired professor from SMU in Texas and has a lot of practical suggestions that would actually help anyone getting to college, not just kids with ADHD. On the left, I have Learning to Learn by Gloria Frender, which was a workbook we found very helpful for helping my son think through what helped him learn and different ways of getting organized. That's just one example of how you might adapt curriculum. Another possibility would be to adapt your materials for a dyslexic child by modifying assignments or using high-low books or audiobooks or adaptive software. Some of you know Joan Green, a speech pathologist in Maryland and Potomac, who has become an expert, one of the nation's leading experts on assistive technology. And her work could help you create a study skills course with an emphasis on assistive technology. You can find Joan at innovativespeech.com. I'm going to make a note. I am planning tomorrow to take all the resources I've mentioned tonight, since I don't have a handout for you, and post them as a new post on my blog. So at learndifferently.com, you can find all that, and I'm planning for that to be tomorrow. You can also adapt how you teach traditional curriculum. You can change where your child learns. My son did 4th grade math under the dining room table. Well, he did have to come up to the table where when I was teaching him, I didn't dive under there with him. But he found that lying on the floor on his stomach, doing math problems on a whiteboard made him a lot happier. Some kids find that deep pressure of lying on their stomach soothing. He didn't get mad erasing his mistakes and tearing holes in his paper because he could just swipe on the whiteboard with the eraser. He also enjoyed those colored markers. He had a cousin who was homeschooled, who studied algebra while standing, not sitting, at the kitchen table, bouncing up and down most of the time, according to Mom. But his cousin went on to graduate from the Naval Academy and is now a Navy helicopter pilot. So you see, all along, she was just trying to gain altitude. When you homeschool, you can get rid of boring curriculum. You don't have to waste your child's time on stuff they've already mastered. We know that for kids with ADHD, boredom is really hard to tolerate. They need to be engaged. As homeschoolers, we also could incorporate movement into our day, all through the day. Of our first 3 years of homeschooling, grades 4, 5, and 6, our math lessons, for instance, were typically over an hour, but we did 7 or 8 activities during that hour in different parts of the house. We went to the kitchen and looked at the wall calendar to review calendar arithmetic. At the beginning, it was things like, what will the date be in 3 weeks? How many days ago was the 31st of December, that sort of thing. We also skip counted around the house, taking big steps or marching forwards and backwards. My son enjoyed bouncing up and down on a mini trampoline as we reviewed math facts, and so on. And of course, under the dining room table when it was time to do his work. I decided in our homeschool that memory work was also important, and we made a game out of it. My son's favorite part, believe it or not, was the push-ups. For every word wrong on the memory work, 1 push-up. My son didn't mind having to do a few push-ups. I think he was proud that he could do them so well. And he loved watching me do push-ups when I got the words wrong, which I did sometimes. Another advantage of homeschooling, the second most popular answer on my survey, was a flexible schedule. When you homeschool, your wake-up time can be reasonable. There's no early bus, like my daughter had for high school. You can schedule the toughest subjects at the time when your student is at their freshest. You can allow frequent breaks for movement. You can modify your schedule for doctor's appointments and occupational therapy, speech therapy, and other therapies. Some families told me that one reason they homeschooled was it was so hard to have to take their child to therapy after school when the child was already tired. Homeschoolers enjoy being able to vacation the off season and avoid crowds. Some of them vacation before a parent deploys or after they return from deployment, because they're not confined to a September to June schedule. For instance, when my husband's work sent him to England for a week, we went too. And to prepare, I ditched our Virginia history curriculum for a couple of months, bought a book from Oxford University Press, and we learned early English history and studied medieval life for 2 months to get ready for our trip. It will be important if you homeschool, though, to develop some routines. I wrote out a weekly schedule, something like the one you see in this picture. I put it on a whiteboard and kept it posted where we could both see it at all times. It helped my son answer his own questions about what to do next, what was next when, and he could use to remind me when I went on too long with our English lessons so that he could go have his soccer break in the yard. As we homeschool, it's also helpful to be able to teach at the kids' own pace was a third most popular answer on my survey. If a child works ahead or behind, it needs more time, that's more manageable. You don't have to have it all finished by June. If the child needs the rest of the summer, that can work. And if they're ready to finish 1 year's curriculum early, that's okay too. Homeschooler also reported to me that they enjoyed that they could monitor medications and reduce stress and reduce distractions. Some kids were coming home from school emotionally exhausted, thinking they were stupid. My son was one of them. But in homeschool, parents are able to restore a love of learning. So if you summarize those first 2 points on the survey, customized schedule and customized curriculum and flexible schedule, you get that the key word in homeschooling is flexibility. Lois, a mother in California who I interviewed for my book, Homeschooling Your Struggling Learner, said when she read aloud to her young son, she discovered that with his ADHD, he could pay attention to the history lessons a lot better if she would just let him sit on the sofa upside down with his head on the floor and his feet sticking up in the air. Another mom in Northern Virginia enrolled her child in public school for high school. A few weeks into the school year, they called her in to ask her advice on helping her son focus. Well, she began, between subjects, I used to let him run laps around the house. And they said, well, we can't do that, obviously. We've got I think they had 600 students and 3 minutes between classes. She said, I also let him sit on the floor during classes. I said, we can't do that. And she said, oh, and I let him chew gum. Well, you know, no school custodian's going to be happy if one kid starts chewing gum, because next thing you know, there'll be 600 pieces of gum on the floor. So flexibility is another advantage of homeschooling. Next, I want to talk with you about resources from the homeschool community that might be of interest to you. First, if you're thinking about exploring homeschooling further, I'll go through those, and then some that apply for all parents. If you're thinking about homeschooling, a lot of parents think, oh, the first thing I need to do is choose a curriculum, but actually that's not it. You need to determine your goals. If you sign up for my newsletter at learndifferently.com, the computer will send you in 24 hours a free goal setting guide that'll get emailed back to you. I also discussed that more in my first book. And then you'll want to explore different homeschooling styles. I can't go into that tonight, but you can Google Charlotte Mason, classical, relaxed homeschooling, eclectic homeschooling. Those are different ways of formatting your day. They relate to your goals. They relate to curriculum you choose and how you teach. There's lots of resources to help you with each of those styles. Another way to begin is to take advantage of two excellent homeschool organizations. Virginia has two. DC also has one, and Maryland has one, but Virginia's have more information on their website, so I'm going to mention them. The resources at both of these websites will help you wherever you live. So if you are listening to this this presentation from anywhere in the world, I would still recommend those two. The two state homeschool organizations are the Home Educators Association of Virginia, that's HEAV.org, and VirginiaHomeschoolers.org, that's VAHomeschoolers.org. Those websites have some excellent webinars that, again, I'd recommend regardless of whether you live in Virginia or not, and lots of good articles. There's an e-magazine at VA Homeschoolers, or maybe I think it's just a blog now, and HEAV has a free magazine you can sign up for. Also at my website, I have two blog posts on how to begin homeschooling. One of them specific to Virginia and has links to Virginia law. I also, at my website, you can sign up if you want to talk with me, because I do give consultations by phone, Zoom, Skype, or whatever. However you want to talk, I'm willing. I would also strongly urge you, if you're thinking about homeschooling, to try to get to a homeschool convention. And I list a few on the slide. The two Virginia organizations, HEAV is the much larger convention. It's one of the 5 largest in the country. And VA Homeschoolers is much smaller. So there's thousands of people at HEAV. The organization was established by Christians, so there's a Christian slant to some of the materials in the vendor hall, but not all. VA Homeschoolers is more eclectic and also much smaller. Last time I was there, there were about 300 people attending, including children. Whereas HAV was, I think, I'm bad at numbers, but perhaps 20,000. I don't know, it's pretty large. One of the 5 largest in the country. If you don't live in the Washington area, then I would check Great Homeschool Conventions, which have locations. I think they're in about 8 states this year around the country. If you visit the vendor hall, you can get samples of curriculum and talk with people who either wrote the curriculum or used it before you buy anything. And I really recommend looking at samples. And also, if you go through the vendor hall, you might collect some discounts. As you're evaluating curriculum, my favorite resource for that is Kathy Duffy. That's CATHY DUFI, KathyDuffyReviews.com. She has reviewed probably more than 1,000 homeschool curriculum, and she writes very thorough reviews. She will tell you if the curriculum is religious or not, how it's organized, what she thinks of its quality. SPED Homeschool also reviews curriculum, not quite as thoroughly or as many years. And I mentioned a few other resources on that slide. Rainbow Resource and Teachers Pay Teachers. Again, you can talk with me if you want to set up a time to talk just about a particular question as you're trying to look for one curriculum for one subject or another. Some of you, though, are absolutely sure you do not want to homeschool, like my book designer. Never intended to homeschool, but I would say to those friends, go to a homeschool convention anyway and visit the vendor hall, because there's a lot of fun stuff there. Craft kits, robotics kits, science kits, the coolest educational stuff I've ever seen all in one place. If you can't make it to a convention, I've listed a few of my favorite websites, particularly timberdoodle.com. That's a homeschooling family in the Pacific Northwest. A timberdoodle's a bird up there. The Miller family started selling pads and paper at homeschool conventions, and now they sell all kinds of cool educational stuff, but they're still called Miller pads and paper. Rainbow Resource is another very large and popular source of homeschool curriculum. You can look at their catalog. All of them have extensive catalogs online. If you go to a homeschool convention, it's a good opportunity to meet some homeschoolers. And if you meet some, whether you're planning to homeschool or not, keep trying to meet more, because there are all kinds of us and we're all very different. So you don't want to miss that. Another concern people have about homeschooling a child with ADHD is sometimes it runs in the family. Now, we know that my son did not get his ADHD from his dad, and I'm not diagnosed, but it's pretty clear who has the tendencies in this household, and it's me and my son. So what do you do then? Can you homeschool if both you and your child have ADHD? Well, one of the homeschool speakers I have become good friends with wrote a book about it. It's called If I'm Diapering a Watermelon, Then Where'd I Leave the Baby? Help for the Highly Distractible Mom. So yes, you can homeschool when you have ADHD and your child has ADHD. And I have 4 simple suggestions for you. Because I admit, homeschooling sounds daunting, even if you're a teacher like I was, whether you have ADHD or not, but especially if you do. It's important to think about 4 things that can help you as you homeschool with ADHD: structure, simplicity, accountability, and fun. By structure, I mean planning ahead of time, having a weekly schedule. Granted, you'll probably write it in pencil or put it on the computer. Putting it up on a whiteboard or a bulletin board where you all can see it is helpful. Keeping it simple. If your child is 3 years behind in reading, if they still don't know their math facts and they're 8 or 10 or 11, don't expect to fix everything in a year. Set reasonable goals. That's something else I'm happy to help you with. Accountability is really important if you are distractible as well as your child. I would sit down weekly with a spouse or a friend and say, here's what I'm planning to do next week. here's what I planned for last week and here's how it went. This could be over the phone, over Zoom, doesn't have to be very long, but just knowing you're doing that will help you stay organized. And fourth, fun. It's important that you and your children enjoy education together, that you enjoy creating and exploring and observing. There are so many resources to help you with this. I could take an hour and talk about that, but I don't have that time. As I said, homeschooling frightens some people. Sometimes parents come to me for advice on this, and I tell you, it's the parents who aren't concerned, the parents who think that it'll be easy that worry me, because most of us know better. When I started homeschooling my son, the beginning of fourth grade, I did not feel qualified at first. It took us a couple years for me to decide to do it. I was wondering how I could learn to teach my son to read when the school hadn't been able to in 4 years, but I did. If you'd say to me, my child won't listen to me anyway, how can I teach them? I would sit down and talk with you, and I would take that very seriously. I'm happy to talk with parents privately about making that decision, because as much as I love education, I think that family relationships are much more important. So your family may need to focus on relationships first. Counseling can help with that. But you should also consider that maybe some of the stress in your relationships is boiling over from the stress of school. My son used to come home from school ready to explode from trying so hard to behave, trying to understand. Maybe you're exhausted from trying to get your child to jump through the hoops of an educational approach that's not well suited for them. Our kids are born to play and to learn, and they learn through play. Their desire to learn can be crushed by years of failure in the schools. As I learned when I attended my first CHAD international conference in Arlington, someone said, if a teacher is teaching a child with ADHD and they're using the same approach for the first 8 months and the child isn't learning, who's the slow learner? Of course, some teachers don't have a choice about changing their options, but some of our kids are very frustrated. I think the biggest gift homeschoolers can give the rest of us parents is to remind us of their homeschool perspective. Homeschoolers can be intentional, and I would encourage you to be more intentional about your educational goals for your child. Write down, what do you want your child to learn, to love, to appreciate? Not just getting through reading, writing, and arithmetic, or getting a good GPA. What do you want them to know about the world, about philosophy, about nature, and how things fit together? Homeschooling families enjoy learning together, not because they're geeks, but because they see the world as fascinating and beautiful. And these families enjoy being together, not 24/7, but they are around together more than their public school neighbors. And these parents enjoy watching their children grow and change, and they get to see more of that and be more engaged in the process of helping their kids learn to think and explore culture and nurture their talents. The parents are more engaged in the process of helping their children grow to be independent, useful citizens serving in the community. And what's better than that? I want to thank you all for listening this evening. And before I take questions, I just want to remind you that you can contact me if I don't get to your questions tonight at learndifferently.com. We can set up a time to talk. There's a little chat bot there where you can send me a request. And you can also sign up for my newsletter. I don't send those out very often, but you should get a goal setting guide within 24 hours. I'll leave that up for just a minute, but I'm finished with my talk and I'm ready to take questions.
If anybody has questions, you can either write them in the chat, or at this point, you could even unmute yourself and ask directly to Kathy if you don't mind, Kathy.
That's fine.
Kathy, you might have already addressed this, but I wanted to ask, with the homeschooling environment, the vetting process of actually graduating from, say, high school, the GPAs and things that are, understood by a college situation where a child would want to go into a four-year college, what kind of accolades or situations or certificates do they get in a homeschooling environment that apply as they go towards college?
Right. Well, homeschool parents issue diplomas, and you might say, well, that's just a piece of paper. What is that worth? Homeschoolers back up that diploma with two things. They back that up with a transcript, and there are workshops to help parents understand how to create a transcript. It's pretty easy to do. I just looked at another one and copied its format, filling in our things. And significantly, as soon as your homeschooled child starts taking high school level classes, even if it's in 7th or 8th grade, and they're taking Algebra 1, for instance, parents should start a file on their computer where they list each course, whether it's a whole credit or a half a credit, what textbook was used, and whether it was a lab science. So a brief 1 or 2 sentence description, like you might see in a college catalog. I submitted that document with our 1-page transcript, and that was accepted. Some universities will also want kids to take a subject SAT. Many homeschooled kids will start taking college classes at a local community college before they graduate, dual enrollment, just as some public school kids do. And of course, some homeschooled kids will take CLEP classes or in other ways, AP courses, and have other evidence of progress. Many homeschooled families with teens will have their kids take 1 or more classes in homeschool co-ops or group classes. As a teacher in one of those homeschool groups, I wrote letters of recommendation for some of my students as well.
Kathy, we have another question. I think this is probably one a lot of parents would want to know about. How would you approach a conversation with a pediatrician who is adamant against homeschooling?
Oh, some of the families I interviewed for homeschooling or struggling learner had that problem. I seriously would consider looking for another pediatrician. I don't mean that to sound brutal or sharp, but it's not fundamentally their decision. I would ask on what basis they have that decision. And, that's actually one reason why I spoke at the Learning Disabilities Association national conferences, at the Autism Society, and at Chad's International Conference. I think I spoke 3 years there, just because I wanted professionals to be aware that homeschooling can be done very responsibly and be a legitimate option. So I think I'd start by asking the physician what the ground was for their objections. The first time I met former LDA president, Dr. Larry Silver, who taught psychiatry at Georgetown, I asked him if he would endorse my book, and he said, "I'm very concerned about how some people homeschool." And I said, "Me too, that's why I'm writing this book." So I think we can educate some professionals, but you may want to look for another doctor.
Thank you. Okay, so we have another question. How quickly could a family switch to homeschooling, and how much lead time do you think that someone would need if they were making that swap?
Oh, that's interesting. I'm going to assume that the child is in a really bad school situation. And if I'm not, maybe this parent could come back to me or contact me afterwards. If your child is in a toxic situation and they're destroying their morale, or they're being bullied, like some homeschool families start homeschooling because of bullying, or whatever situation, and you need to get the child out in a hurry, you can do that immediately. You need to notify the school in the school system that you're withdrawing. You need to notify the county. In Virginia, it's a reasonable amount of time that you're homeschooling. And I could walk a family through that process. It's pretty simple. You don't have to give a lot of information. You can list in Virginia, you list what subjects you're planning to cover. You don't even have to list textbooks right now. But what I would do in that particular case, assuming a child is in distress, is I would pull them out and plan a time of deschooling, maybe 2 to 3 weeks. Deschooling is a process to help kids recover from situations like that, and of a really bad school situation. In deschooling, there isn't formal instruction, but you provide a lot of rich educational materials and resources, good art supplies, a huge stack of books from a library and their favorite subjects, trips where you go places together outdoors if they're interested in that. And so they're educational, but they don't feel like school. And that gives your child a chance to begin to recover their interest in learning, which can be sort of beaten out of us if we're frustrated enough. And that, because it's important for this parent coming to this situation to take some time to actually plan, to set their goals beyond helping their kids survive, and choose appropriate curriculum. And that's not something you can do over a weekend in most cases.
So as students finish secondary education, is it common for homeschool students often to opt out into a bridge program rather than going directly to post-secondary college university?
I don't have numbers on that. My impression is that most homeschoolers go on to college. Some of them will go into the trades. In fact, there's a great homeschool Facebook group and website called Blue Collar Homeschool. I think in general, the trades are overlooked in our society, and that should be considered. Some people do a gap year or a bridge program. My son took a gap year and he worked several different jobs, and then he returned to community college.
So someone has said, my middle school son needs one-on-one support because of his distractibility. We do local homeschool classes that are very small, but are electives. Is there a list of teachers that teach the main core classes for family?
I don't know of a list of teachers. I've reached out to ShareNet, the email newsletter for homeschoolers, just this morning to see if they were still publishing. I would look at homeschool group pages on Facebook and see what they recommend in terms of teachers. I worked for many years teaching at Chess, a homeschool group that was based in Centerville and is now in Manassas. And in that case, the teachers are independent contractors. Their courses run if they get 5 or more students, and it's up to those contractors to determine whether or not they're a good fit for a particular child. And as an administrator in that program, I helped those teachers make those decisions. So no, I don't have a list of teachers that teach core subjects, but the core subjects are all taught at Chess. I think Course Compass also teaches core subjects, and I'm happy for this parent to reach out to me, and I'll try to connect them. I've been assuming this person's in Northern Virginia, but if they're in DC, all that was a waste of their time, and I'm sorry. I'm happy to try and connect you with resources individually.
Those are the questions we have. Would anybody else have a question they'd like to ask at this point?
Okay, I have another question. Here we have parents working very hard to homeschool their children. Is there any kind of financial compensation for the parent that's home and homeschooling? Teachers get paid a salary of some sort to teach in public schools, but what about the private school sector? Is there any compensation there?
Homeschoolers in Virginia, and as far as I know, DC and Maryland do not receive financial support from the government. And there are states where that's the case, in Alaska, in some of the, maybe all of the Canadian provinces, that's the case. I don't know of other states than Alaska that provide some help that way. A lot of homeschoolers are wary of that kind of help because after fighting to get the right to homeschool and to avoid a lot of onerous regulation and restriction, some homeschoolers feel pretty strong that they want to be able to choose curriculum. Now, I understand about loss of income being a concern for homeschool families, and there are families I know and I've interviewed who have managed to work while homeschooling. There's a lot of creative ways you can do that, involving shifts and some other strategies that I'm happy to talk with families about. But I don't know of many states other than Alaska where parents do get some stipend to spend toward homeschooling, but it's not a salary or anything close to that. It's a stipend to help cover expenses, and in Canada it covers some extracurriculars, but in Canada some of the homeschoolers are objecting to how that's restricted.
Thank you very much.
It appears those are the questions we have. Somebody has said there is something from federal government to pay caregivers, that people might be able to look into that.
Well, it is true that in North Carolina, I know some special needs families that were able to get coverage, but that was not part of education. It might have been Social Security or Medicare. I've forgotten details. That's been more than 10 years since I talked with them about that. But it's worth checking with the ARC of Northern Virginia or your local ARC chapter, the ARC, to see about compensation for caregivers. And also respite care.
Thank you. At this time, those are the questions we have. We'd like to thank Kathy Kuhl for her amazing presentation tonight. We learned a lot. We will see everybody again, and you're getting many accolades in the chat, Kathy. We'll see everybody again next month with our February webinar that we will be having. And Pam, would you like to introduce what the webinar will be for next month?
Yeah, I'd love to. I am part of the ADHD College Success Guidance Program, and we are going to have a interactive topic. The topic is growing college success from first semester failure. And myself and my colleague, Dr. John Thomas, are going to be talking about how students can monitor and manage when things start going a little south in the school system, whether it be college or high school or middle school. We have a little bit of a little chart for everybody to fill out and to kind of monitor that the descent into what we call zone 2, which we can explain during the lecture. But it's about students taking ownership of what's happening in their academic journey, and being able to notice the differences and some things that are going wrong and how to fix them. So that's for February. Mm-hmm.
So more about flexibility and ownership, which
Yes,
seem to be, really wonderful ways to look at education and at a rich education that we can offer our children. So again, thank you very much, Kathy. We really appreciate you meeting with us tonight. And we have put Kathy's website in the chat. Please, anybody who would like to speak with her privately, contact her and she will be able to help you. She's an expert at this. So thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you for having me. Good night.